Hello everyone, we'll start in a few minutes. Thank you for waiting.
The Cordillera region in the northern part of the Philippines is the ancestral homeland of various indigenous peoples comprising the majority of 1.7 million regional population. Half of the population are located in the urban Baguio City and the province of Benguet, where two large mining companies are operating. Being the mountainous and cold climate, the region supplies 70% of temperate vegetables in the country, as well as being the major producer of cut flowers. Thus, with the lockdown quickly imposed on the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the most affected are the informal workers in the urban city, farmers of cut flowers, and the vegetable industry. Because indigenous farmers in the interior communities are producing for their own communities and own consumption, the dislocation is on the disruption of their otherwise seasonal work in the urban and provincial centers.
I am Carmen Bulinto, a health worker working here in the Cordillera region. And I also teach in the university with nursing students. And I also volunteer with non-government organizations in health. Now, on the second to the last day of our clinical duty in the community, the government officials declared that there should be a closure of businesses, of business establishments, of the schools. In relation to the vulnerable communities, I would like to believe that these vulnerable communities are those in the marginalized sectors, in the far-flung areas. They will be at a more double risks in case the infection will enter the communities. They had been so isolated geographically, and that can be a positive protection for them. But once people who are coming from the outside, like for example from the cities or from overseas, and these are people coming from positive COVID communities, then they will be the most vulnerable. Why? Again, because the healthcare system that is supposed to take care of them is not ready, and it's very inadequate. The services are inadequate, the hospitals, the facilities, the health manpower, and the medicines and others, most especially for the protective personal equipment, these are very inadequate to give them support. As a healthcare professional, I think one of the most important challenge is really to support these indigenous communities, those who are in the marginalized areas, because if no one will do that to them, they will be at so much risk. We have been demanding for mass testing, but it has never been given to the people, especially for the health workers.
Nung last March, yun na, nagkakanda-kanda hirap na yung mga taxi, jeepney, UB Express. And so, with the bus companies na pinahinto nung pandemic na to, malaki yung epekto sa kabuhayan namin na mga driver sa maliliit na operator.
Katawan mo ti dadu mga alternative ta lockdown nga ron siyang kang agutang siyang kalpasan da iti puwi da ka kamutbutong mo nga utang ati sangsangon tumanen sumaron.
Nagrugi ti lockdown ket jay nagrugi met nga awan tinaila ko nga pulos jay nulami ket naibasura amin titansyak lang ban nga 200,000.
Ti epekto na dahito ang pandemya ket talaga nga krisis han kami nga makalako awan ti panggatang ti kanon ni adaman ti ito ti gobyerno talaga nga kurang.
The Cordillera People's Alliance is an alliance of 307 people's organizations and sectoral organizations in the different provinces of the Cordillera region in northern Philippines. Throughout these decades as well, we have been partnering with the Center for Development Programs in the Cordillera, especially in providing socio-economic projects or support to far-flung indigenous communities in the region. Throughout these decades of our existence as an organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance has been experiencing attacks for speaking out against corporate projects such as large-scale mining and large dams, for criticizing policies of the government that impact negatively on Cordillera indigenous peoples, as well as indigenous peoples in other parts of the country. So during the time of COVID, the attacks against us have intensified, especially through social media, particularly Facebook. So since the lockdown in March until now, there are
Good
numerous
afternoon,
posts
everyone.
at Facebook and
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Um, Welcome to the AEPF, the Asia Europe People's Forum, the 13th edition webinar on people's resistance against shrinking spaces in the time of COVID-19. And my name is Glenis. I will be one of your moderators this afternoon. The other one is Ima of the Asia Pacific Research Network, and we will both host this afternoon's event. And thank you for attending this event. Um, I would like to introduce some house rules first, very quick, because you will see that the house rules will be displayed on the bottom side of your screen. So we are in a meeting format. We are not in a webinar format, so we can see each other. And we, with this format, we can have our workshops, the two workshops that we prepared later on. So just a bit of the house rules. Please turn off your video and audio if you are not speaking, and in order to avoid unwarranted background noises that can distract other participants. And during the Q&A session, click the raise hand button if you want to ask a question, and the moderator will acknowledge and grant you permission to unmute your microphone at an appropriate time. We are also live on Facebook. Please share the video, the live video from the page of IBON International. And you can use the hashtag AEPF13 when you tweet or when you share the videos. So I will turn over the moderating to my partner, Ima.
So, welcome everyone to the webinar on people's resistance against shrinking spaces in the time of COVID-19. This is the 13th biennial conference of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. And for the first time, this conference is being organized in a virtual way. The Asia-Europe People's Forum, or AEPF, is an interregional network of progressive civil society organizations from across Asia and Europe, committed to fostering people's solidarity for a socially and economically just, inclusive, peaceful, sustainable, and ecologically sensitive development within and across the two regions. We ask for respectful engagement with the principals and one another, and request that we behave accordingly, as Glennis mentioned in the chat box. And so the chat box is open for our questions. Should I proceed, Glennis?
Yes.
Okay. To begin our webinar, I would like to introduce the keynote speaker, Mr. Aaron Saradoy. He is the General Manager of the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants in Hong Kong. APMM is a regional institution supporting empowerment of migrants and their movement building. So this is for our first keynote speaker. Aaron, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you to the organizers of this webinar for inviting us to speak in this space. This topic is very timely, as in this time of the pandemic, not only are the people's health and livelihood at risk, Attacks to people, civil society, and social movements are also on the rise, which are generated both by the situation COVID-19 presents, as well as the built-up public discontent triggered by the economic, political, and social problems aggravated and exposed by the pandemic. We will be remiss in our understanding of the state of civic space in this time of COVID-19 without putting the pandemic itself in its proper context. More than a year since the world was gripped by the pandemic, the economic and social costs have been tremendous. Economic trends reported contraction, production slowdown, downhill GDPs, and displacement of people, especially the workers, peasants, and those already on the fringes. More than 165 million have been infected, while 3.4 million died. Hospitals have been overrun, shortages in medical supplies were reported, and the people's education and social life have been disrupted. While optimists in international bodies and financial institutions project recovery in the next few years, the best that they can project is a slowdown, a slow one, and the worst is the prolonged state of the world situation. This condition, however, is not new. Even before the COVID-19 was discovered, the world's economy was already in a slump characterized by recession, a sluggish growth, conflicts among powers, and multiple crises, economic, political, social, and ecological, in all global regions. The COVID-19 pandemic magnified and sped up the impacts of this crisis to the people and revealed fundamental flaws in structures shaped for decades by neoliberal dogmas and strategies. It is no wonder that before the pandemic, actions by social movements have sprouted from Asia to Europe, from Hong Kong to France, from the Philippines to the US. Actions participated in or led by workers, rural peoples, urban poor, indigenous peoples, women, migrants, and young people were happening that triggered reactions of repression through policies or by direct force by the states. Alarm bells were already ringing on shrinking space and oppressive moves against movements and organized peoples even before the pandemic. Similar to the economic slide, the pandemic sped up the enforcement and institutionalization of repressive laws and practices. Capitalizing on the legitimate fear of infection spread, pandemic response in many countries were characterized with resulting clampdowns on collective actions, paralyzation of community organizations, and severe limitations to civil societies on advocacy and engagement. The freezing effect of COVID-19 was exploited to push through policies that restrict the right to information, to organizing, and to assembly. In repressive and militaristic states, multiple arrests were made on critics, or worse, activists were extrajudicially killed. Restrictions on civil society registration, resourcing, and therefore operations were put up with the aim of draining the capacity of civil society to campaign, lobby, educate, research, and empower people. It has been much worse among frontline human rights defenders from all across sectors, but especially those in trade unions, workers' organizations, peasant associations, and other organized forms of other sectors. But as also seen before the pandemic, crisis and repression breeds resistance. Despite the pandemic, despite the dangers, people's actions still erupted with massive ones in many countries. Creativity flourished among movements to find ways to act collectively, register criticisms or opposition, highlight the realities on the ground, and push for demands on both immediate and strategic concerns. As digital platforms played key roles maintaining connections, developing unities, and continuing collectivization of actions, civil society and people's organizations took to the task of arming themselves with the knowledge, skills, and infrastructure needed to navigate online engagements, mount online actions, and still operate in solidarity with social distancing in place. We know it is not enough, though. We know that it will never replace the militance, the vibrance, and solid will that is most palpable in the physical coming together.
But we also do know that no venue is closed for a movement that is determined to struggle for genuine change. The challenges posed by COVID and shrinking space are enormous. An activist friend shared this thought in this harrowing time for his people. He said, "It is not the COVID-19 that the people are afraid of. It is that feeling of hopelessness that they know that if they get infected, they could not do much as the system is not built and directed to respond to the crisis and especially ensure the fundamental changes that serve the people will happen. A system that represses will strive to reduce spaces for people's movements to act and flourish with or without the pandemic. People's social movements must not only work to resist such shrinking of the space, it must actually tear asunder the limits set by those who control power and resources and release the boundless potentials and hope in a system that truly upholds the rights and serves the interests of the people." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for emphasizing how people's movements and CSOs have fought back despite various limitations and are emerging from this pandemic still in fighting form. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, to those who just joined us. This webinar is brought to you by IBON International Europe, People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty, Council for People's Development and Governance, Viva Salud, and Asia Pacific Research Network. Welcome. And to share with us how the pandemic has been weaponized, how activists, grassroots organizations, and civil society groups have resisted against neoliberal policies that various governments have tried to implement in the middle of the pandemic, please welcome our next speaker, Saro Jenny Renkam. Saro is an environmentalist and feminist and is the executive director of Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific, an organization that is based in Penang, Malaysia. So please welcome Saro.
Thank you, Glenys. Thank you for the invitation to speak and share what's happening in the Asia Pacific region. The closing of civic and democratic spaces is a concern, not only in the Asia Pacific region, but also globally. The COVID-19 pandemic, as Aaron has shared, has exposed the policies that intensify the social, political, and economic injustices in Asia Pacific, including intensifying the impact of decades of imperialism and neoliberal agendas of privatization, reduced spending on people services, and trade deals that favor big businesses. Moreover, social and economic inequalities and the loss of lives and livelihoods has increased tremendously, and we are also seeing the erosion of the right to development. In this scenario, the most affected are the poorest and the most vulnerable segments of the population, including migrants, the displaced, and those hit by conflict. Countries in protracted crisis like Palestine also suffer from underinvestment in public health, which will amplify the pandemic's impacts. Vulnerable groups also include small-scale farmers, informal workers, agricultural workers, pastoralists, and fishers facing challenges assessing markets to sell their products or buy essential inputs, or struggle due to higher food prices and limited purchasing power. Informal laborers will be hard hit by job and income losses in both the urban and rural areas. This pandemic is actually expected to put 1.6 billion workers in the informal sector, nearly half the global workforce, in immediate danger of losing their livelihoods. Governments have use severe measures such as implementing emergency laws where parliament sitting is cancelled. For example, in Malaysia, access to vaccines are being restricted, as well as who gets the vaccine is decided by a few politicians. We are also seeing during this pandemic and lockdowns, more policing and militarist interventions in the pretext of solving the issues due to the pandemic. This is not for ensuring the health and security of people, but to aggressively implement anti-people policies such as neoliberal policies and land and resource grabbing, as well as to quell protests and resistance against such policies and laws. On top of the loss of lives and livelihoods of people, we are seeing extrajudicial killings, harassments, and false accusations, and open violations of human rights. This policy, more security imposition and jail time prevent any people's protests and their right to dissent. And the Philippines and Myanmar are case in point. In the Philippines, we have 376 extrajudicial killings with 488 victims of frustrated EJKs. 103,843 cases of harassment, threats, intimidation. That includes 323 peasants killed, 68 from indigenous peoples, and 451 political prisoners arrested under Duterte's administration. In December 2020, 9 indigenous Tumandok people in Panay Island were massacred for fighting against the construction of the Jalor mega dam, which would submerge their communities, including the agricultural lands and cultural sites. Last February 2021, 26 indigenous Lumat leaders, students, and teachers were arrested in Cebu province, where they took refuge after they were displaced from their ancestral lands in Mindanao, southern Philippines, for corporate mining interests. I would like to acknowledge two leaders of the peasant movements of the Philippines, or KMP, Ka Randy Ekanis, brutally killed due to extrajudicial killings, and Ka Joseph Canlas, falsely arrested and died in prison due to COVID-19. These are leaders that I met and deeply respect for their commitment and for organizing communities to assert their rights over land and resources and to oppose the corporate control of these lands. As of 27 April 2021, in Myanmar, at least 756 protesters and bystanders, of which at least 44 were children, have been killed by military or police forces, and at least 3,449 people were detained. Peoples in the Philippines and Myanmar and other peoples who face the same predicament, especially in the global south, are struggling against similar repression, systems of oppression, the same institutions and transnational corporations. The Tatmadaw re-established their dictatorship in Myanmar in February, but the Burmese, including ethnic people, say that the military has maintained a powerful grip on the country even when there was a civilian government. In the Philippines, people face similar militarism under Duterte, who appointed more military and police officials than even the Marcos dictatorship. People's organizations say that the country is under a de facto dictatorship, and Duterte has captured all government branches. In both countries, governance is driven by the business interests of the ruling elite. Myanmar's military monopolizes the country's major industries, while Duterte's cronies are amassing wealth through neoliberal mega infrastructure projects. In India, another major where people are facing shrinking spaces, the Modi government came out with 3 farm laws in the midst of pandemic. These policies are meant to support the big Indian corporations, but they would destroy the livelihoods of farmers as well as badly impact poor consumers. There were no consultations with farmers and those who will be affected. It was just railroaded in June last year. Since November last year, thousands of farmers and support sectors have protested these laws as being anti-farmer and anti-people. However, the Modi government is not budging. As one farmer said, we basically, if it was to safeguard the people against the pandemic, then this law should not have been implemented at this point in time. And that's the situation now. But again, even during the COVID-19 lockdown, we saw in India another amendment introduced last year to the Foreign Contribution Act, which affects thousands of non-profit organizations who have continued to work for millions of Indians, particularly coping with the humanitarian and financial crisis that the pandemic created. This law is more stringent, more expensive for non-profits, and is detrimental to their operations. So instead of creating an enabling environment, the Indian government is ensuring erosion of people's rights and limiting the space for CSOs and people's movements. Really, the shrinking space is happening in India as we speak. We need to therefore link up our issues and see that human health and the protection of the environment and human rights are intrinsically linked. We need to recognize that the issues that people face are systemic and they are linked. They are exploited and impoverished by a profit-oriented global economic system and suffer under similar neoliberal policies pushed by multilateral banks, the WTO, and others. And this is facilitated by the landlords and elites at the national level, and at all levels, the big corporations are profiting. Peoples and their organizations who fight for their rights and sovereignty against corporate and elite interests are the main targets of political repression. Peasant and indigenous peoples, communities in such rural areas are militarized to facilitate corporate plunder and land grabbing. But the people are still resisting. The people are fighting back. And in this context, we really need, there's a strong grounds for people's movements, organizations, and civil society to strengthen solidarity in our common struggle for rights and sovereignty, and link our demands towards justice and accountability. The people's movements in Asia Pacific are organizing, we are mobilizing and resisting and protesting continuously against oppression, repression, and exploitation. And we are building solidarity and working for change. And this will continue as long as we are strong and we are together. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Saro, for expounding on how pandemic response in Asia Pacific has been weaponized against the vulnerable sectors in terms of the economic, political, and social spheres. As many Asian countries have implemented repressive policies during the pandemic, let's see how it is in the more developed side of the world. To present the situation of shrinking spaces and people's resistance, we have Yoke Kaliward of Progress Lawyers Network in Belgium. PLN is a network of progressive law firms with about 30 lawyers who want to use the law for social justice. Yoke, you have the floor.
Thank you. Do you hear me well? Is it okay? Okay. Thanks for inviting us to this webinar. First of all, I want to wish a lot of strength to all the people all over the world, and more especially in Gaza at this moment, because I think the situation is extremely difficult. But about COVID, as you said, we are a developed country, and so the situation is, of course, not that problematic as in your countries, since we have another totally other situation. But that doesn't mean that there is also problems here due to COVID. So first of all, I think it's important to say that in Belgium, there was a big, there have been a lot of people who died due to COVID. We are a little country, but still in that little country, more than 25,000, I think, people died. And so that rate is quite high, also compared to non-developed countries. In Belgium, actually, the measures that were taken due to COVID were not measures to say that they wanted to crush the virus, but that they wanted to flatten the curve. That means that They said we need to have enough place in the hospitals. As long as we have enough place in the hospitals, people can be treated when they are sick. But there were not measures taken to crush the virus, which means that the authorities never tried or properly tried to do the good measures, let's say tracking, tracing, and isolating the people who are sick. They instead of that, they took measures to responsibilize the individuals and to put all the responsibility on every citizen of the country, but not on their proper responsibility of the government, I mean. And so we saw that the government was much more interested or much more concerned about the economics of the country and of the big corporate businesses in our country, instead of being worried about the health of the peoples, of the citizens and the people working or living in Belgium. And they decided to take measures that the economics could go on. So that means that they decided to classify the industry into essential business or not essential business, but almost everybody was concerned as essential business, which means that all the people, even in the lockdown, needed to go to work. And if you could work at home, you should work at home, but the big industries, the big fabrics, they continued on working. And so we saw that the virus was very much spread in in these areas, because you have, for example, the big fabrics of where they made the cars, the Audi or Volkswagen cars. Those are big industries where 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people work together, and so they kept on working, which has as consequence that a lot of people got sick in those industries, and so the unions in some of those industries put a lot of pressure and organized strikes, which means that the people at the end won and that they should not go to work as long as the virus was that high. And so that means that the people struggled, did put the pressure enough on the government to decide that those industries needed to close, and that although the people didn't go to work, they still got paid, but then by the state, of course, and a little bit less than their own income. But when I mean that the measures were taken to control or to put a lot of responsibility on the citizens, that means that there were a lot of measures that were taken who are violating our fundamental rights. There was a curfew that has been installed. It only finished 1 week ago, 1 week and a half ago, and there was a lot of measures that were taken which were very, very antisocial. So, for example, old people, they stayed in the homes for old people. Nobody could go and visit them, so they needed to stay in these houses or hospitals and couldn't get out of these houses or hospitals, which means that during a lot of months, people couldn't see their children or their grandchildren. And in the houses of each one, nobody could invite anyone unless their proper family. But so that also has a lot of consequences, because people who are living alone, they are living in a very, very isolated way, which has a whole lot of psychological problems for a whole lot of people who couldn't see anyone anymore. And we were in the beginning not allowed to leave our house unless to go and buy food or to go to work. But to go to work, you needed to take the tram or the metro or the buses. And so that means that still the virus was going on. And so it was quite contradictory to say that one hand you couldn't go or invite someone in your house, like your parents or your brother or your sister or whoever, but you could go, you needed to go every day to your work and to see your colleagues, and were on places where the distance could not be respected. the social distance could not be respected. We saw also that those employers, they all said that they were going to respect the social distance measures, but there was no control at all. So there was some inspection, but what's very, very low. And so that means that there was no control, and so that the employers, even if they did not respect the social distance, or their workers could not respect the social distance, they didn't get any measures or fines or whatever for those reasons. But the repression that was against the normal people, against the people who are just living in the cities and while not working, those measures were very strong and very repressive. That means that if you go out of your house and that you were not allowed to go out of your house, you can get a fine of 250 euros, and that can go up until 4,000 euros, which is a whole lot of money for people who don't have any income. And we saw that in the neighborhoods where the poor people are living, they are living in very narrow houses with no gardens or with no space for the children. And so those people needed to stay in their house, but it was quite impossible for them to stay in their houses. And so if they go out for a walk and they didn't they did not respect the rules, they got a lot of fines. And so we saw that those fines were really, really given much, much more in the areas where the people are poor, which is even a double measure, let's say, because they need to stay in their houses in a situation which is very difficult. And on the other hand, if they go out, they get punished. Although people who are rich, they could live in their big houses with their big yards and no problem. They were even enjoying the confinement because they said, we finally have some me time. And those people were not subjected to fines or whatever. We saw also that those measures that were taken were very unclear. So, for example, it was decided that you could not sit on a bank, for example, on the ground in a park, for example, but it was not really in the law, but it was written on the frequently asked questions of the government's sides. And so the police, since those measures were not clear at all, the police could themselves decide what is the measure that needs to be respected. And so there was a lot of police violence due to the rules that were not clear, and that the police says, we have the right to give you those rules, or that you should respect those rules, although the people said, but those rules doesn't exist. And so it was a really, really, and it still is, it's still the case, a situation where you have rules that are not clear at all, and so that the police is using that to put a lot of repression in especially in the neighborhoods, and a lot of violence in the neighborhoods. And so there was one boy who was killed due to a police intervention because he fled away because he was outside and he could not be outside according to the police, and because he didn't do any essential movement, he stayed, he needed to stay in his house, so he ran away, and there was an accident, and therefore that boy died because of the police car that killed him. So those things are more than problematic. On the other hand, we saw also that all those rules that were taken were not taken on a democratic way. The government, once that the COVID started, they created an expert and some sort of an expert league, and in that expert organization were the ministers, the security officers, and some experts. But those experts were mostly medical experts or experts from the employers, but not from the employees. So the unions were not in that instance, and that instance could take themselves all decisions without any control of the parliament. So this is really, really problematic, because those laws that have been taken were all not it were taken with special forces that were given to the government without any parliament control or democratic control. So this was new, and there were also some sort of new rules that were put into due to the COVID, and those were rules that were for whom, let's say, the security and the police forces were waiting for a long time to be able to do. For example, a curfew, it's something which is really problematic, but they, in some cities or some villages, they already tried to do it before, to introduce curfew for other security reasons before the COVID, but it was always rejected by the courts. But now the curfew in the night from 10 o'clock in the night until I think 6 o'clock in the morning, were taking during several months, and the judges accept it. So this is a rule that is newly introduced and that might be repeated in the future, and we are very scared for it, that some of those rules will stay, although the COVID will hopefully disappear. Another rule that they wanted to introduce, but that luckily they did not, they could not, is that the police could enter into the houses to check whether there was someone with you or not, someone else than the family who's living in the house. And so they wanted to do it without control or without authorization of a judge, which is a fundamental right that will be not violated, because your house, normally the police cannot get into your house. But we saw that there was a lot of critics against it, but even then the police, when they went to the houses, they say, okay, we can go in because of COVID. And so a lot of people are afraid to say to the police, you cannot come in. And so it is also a new measure that we are scared that they are introducing it due to COVID, and that it might continue or might become really a law when COVID is gone.
Can you please wrap up? Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Then there's just the issue of the manifestation, the right to manifestation, which was also very much violated and still is. So since the COVID, they said that it was there was no right to do any manifestation at all anymore. At this moment, we can do a manifestation with only 50 people and not more, although again, in some industries, they are working with 3,000 or more in one closed space. So we don't understand why this right to manifestation is blocked, but it still is. And we saw that when there are manifestations, two manifestations which were little manifestations, but against police violence, everybody was arrested, which means, and even more people that were present in the manifestation, and there was a lot of violence used also. So we see now that, for example, last week there was a big manifestation for Palestine, and there, since there was too much people, they could not block it, but it is really, really a problem, because the unions, they don't get authorization to do manifestations, and so we see that they take measures on an economic way for example, the wages or for the pensions or whatever, and that it's extremely difficult to organize manifestations against it because of COVID, because of the rules of COVID. And so now we see that the unions are starting. One union did organize a little action, and there were a lot of fines that were given to those people, but the unions, they decided not to pay those fines. And so we go to court to see whether yes or no we can win on the fact that we say that the decisions that were taken were not taken for a proper democratic way, and so that the laws have not been respected for how you need to take new laws. But secondly, also that the fundamental rights should be more important than economic rights, and then the economic rights of the big business. And so therefore, we hope that in court we will win the fact that those unions refuse to pay those fines. But so we see that there's a lot of, that COVID is really used to fight unions, to fight against manifestations, and to fight also against the cultural world, because the cultural world are not allowed at all to do any theater or concert or whatever. And we saw that also there's a lot of movement against it, and it made the cultural world more strong, which is a good thing. But so we need to be careful in also in our countries that the democratic rights need to be respected, and that in the meantime COVID can be crushed by other rules, and not rules saying that we need to that diminish or makes the democracy violated. I think I finished right now.
Thank you, Yoke, for sharing the struggles of the working people in Belgium and how the policies that have been implemented are really repressive towards the poorer people in the country. And I'm going to introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker is Attorney Ephraim or Ray Cortez, the Secretary General of the National Union of People's Lawyers in the Philippines, and one of the lead counsels for petitioners against the anti-terror law in the Philippines. And UPL is a nationwide association of human rights lawyers, as well as law students, paralegals, and legal workers in the Philippines, united by a commitment to the defense, protection, and promotion of human rights, especially for the poor and the oppressed. So the floor is yours, Attorney Ray.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all. So my topic is regarding international human rights instruments and mechanism. Next, please. Exacting accountability against human rights violators is essential in curbing human rights climate of impunity. Domestic remedies are there primarily to protect the rights of citizens and to provide them with relief in their case, in case their rights are violated. Of course, a failure to investigate, prosecute human rights violations is one of the badges of impunity. International norms and standards recognize the primacy of domestic remedies. However, in certain instances where these remedies become ineffective, resort can be made to international remedies. So tonight I will be discussing, next slide please, the remedies under the following: the UN Human Rights Committee, the remedies under the International Criminal Court, and the Magnitsky Act. Next slide please. The United Nations Human Rights Committee is a mechanism under the optional protocol on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, designed to ensure compliance with the provisions of the ICCPR. It's differentiated with the UN Human Rights Council, which is more policy and policy-making body created under the UN Charter. Next slide, please. The functions are: one, to receive and consider reports submitted by the UN member states as regards the compliance with ICCPR. They are also with jurisdiction to receive and adjudicate complaints by individuals who claim that their rights under the ICCPR have been violated. Next slide, please. The requirements for before the UNHRC will take cognizance of the case are the following. One, the state party which the complainant is against which the complaint is filed should be a signatory to the ICCPR and the optional protocol creating the UN Human Rights Committee. The complainant should have exhausted all available domestic remedies, and the matter are not a subject. It's not a subject of another procedure of international investigation or settlement. The complaint should be in writing and duly signed by the complainant. Next slide, please. Upon filing of the criminal complaint and after resolving that it has jurisdiction of the matter, the UNHRC shall then transmit the complaint to the state party under complaint, which in turn is given a period of 6 months to reply to the complaint. After the lapse of the 6-month period, whether the state party complies or not, the UNHRC shall then deliberate on and resolve the complaint based on the communications, documents submitted to it by the individual complainant and the state party under complaint. Next slide, please. So far in the Philippines, we have 2 cases filed before the UNHRC, where we are able to get favorable findings. One is the case of Benjamin Hernandez, who was killed, a human rights advocate who was killed in Mindanao by state forces, and a submission or complaint was filed with the UNHRC. And the UNHRC held that there were sufficient basis to hold responsible the government of the Philippines for the killing of Beng Hernandez, and that there has been a violation of Article 6, Paragraph 1 of the Covenant. The second case is the case of Eden Marceliana and Eddie Gumanoy. The two are human rights advocates and peasant leaders and mass leaders in Mindoro, in southern part of Luzon, who were also extrajudicial killed under the Arroyo administration. And the UNHRC found that the Philippine government have failed on its obligation under Article 6 in conjunction with Article 2, Paragraph 3 for its failure to properly investigate the death of Eden Marceliana and Eddie Gumanoy and to take appropriate step against those found guilty. The Philippine government was also found to have violated its obligations under Article 9, Paragraph 1, and it was sufficiently established that Eden Marceliana has been previously threatened, that state forces incited violations against her because of her human rights work. These are favorable findings. The problem is those involved in the killing were not investigated and prosecuted. Despite the findings, no such investigation was conducted by the Philippine government. And we're still finding ways on how to enforce the judgment here in the Philippines. Next slide, please. We go now to the International Criminal Court, which is an intergovernmental organization that sits in The Hague. The ICC has jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for the international crimes of genocides, crime against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. Next slide, please. The procedures followed by the ICC are the following. First is preliminary investigation, where they determine whether there is sufficient basis that a crime falling within its jurisdiction was committed that requires an investigation. It's only when the case hurdles this part that the investigation proper commences. And the purpose of the investigation proper is now to interview witnesses, gather evidence, to identify suspect, and to see whether there's basis to conduct the investigation proper. If the prosecution finds that there is sufficient evidence, he can now request for the issuance of a summons for the suspect to voluntarily appear before the ICC. If the suspect fails to do so, a warrant for his arrest may be issued. It's then that the pre-trial and trial proper commences. Next slide, please. Case against Duterte, of course, a communication against Duterte was filed in 2018 with the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC. And this is the first case initiated directly by the families of victims themselves against a sitting head of state. Next slide, please. And the basis for the complaint are as follows. Article 7, Paragraph 1 for crimes against humanity, for widespread and systematic attack against civilians, resulting in at least 4,400 civilians. This is the figure at the time of the filing in August of 2018. There were more killings after that, which required us to submit 2 additional supplemental submissions. Article 7, paragraph K, for widespread and systematic attack against civilians in the form of inhumane acts, intentionally causing great suffering or serious body or mental or physical health under anti-drug policy. Next slide, please. And Article 7, paragraph K, for widespread and systematic attack against civilians in the form of inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or injury to body or mental or physical health under his drug policy, involving which led to the death of thousands, the arrests of thousands, the illegal searches of thousands of residents, and the torture of many. Those arrested and other injuries under Duterte's policy caused on the victims and the families. Article 25, paragraph 2 and 3, for being the most senior leader and most responsible for these crimes. Next slide, please. And paragraph 28 is also criminally responsible under the principle of command responsibility. Next slide, please. These are the bases to investigate and prosecute based on the following. The mass murder and rights violations are so grievous and so heinous that are of sufficient gravity to justify further action of the court. Duterte is not being investigated or prosecuted, has not been previously investigated or prosecuted for the grounds raised in the complaints. The Philippine justice system is unable to prosecute Duterte because presidents are expressly immune from suit under the Philippine justice system. Next slide, please. Developments as of December 5, 2018, the special prosecutor maintained that it retains jurisdiction for acts committed prior to the effectivity of the withdrawal because prior effective March of 2019, I think, the withdrawal of the Philippines from the ICC became effective. But according to the ICC special prosecutor, it retains jurisdiction for acts committed prior to the effectivity of withdrawal, and it's still in the process of assessing the information and evidence. There was supposed to be a investigation to be conducted somewhere in Thailand in July of 2020, but the schedule was canceled because of the pandemic. We go now to this. The Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012. Of course, it's directed against Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian tax lawyer, was detained and abused and was killed while who died while in detention. Next slide, please. And this law is directed against those responsible for the detention, abuse, and death of Sergei Magnitsky. It is also directed against those responsible for the extrajudicial killings and other gross human rights violations committed against individuals seeking to expose illegal activity carried out by officials of the government of the Russian Federation or to obtain, exercise, defend, or promote internationally recognized human rights and freedoms, such as the freedom of religion, expression, association, assembly, and the rights to a fair trial and democratic elections in Russia, and those who acted as an agent of or on behalf of person in a matter relating to an activity described in the earlier paragraphs. Next slide, please. What are the sanctions under the Magnitsky law? 1, ineligibility to receive visa, revocation of existing visa, and freezing of assets. Next slide, please. Procedure, the Secretary of State was directed within 120 days from the effectivity of the law to submit a list of those persons covered by the law in consultation with the Secretary of Treasury to the U.S. Congress, and to publish the list in the National Register. The chairperson and 1 ranking member of the appropriate committee may also recommend inclusion of individuals in the list by submitting the same to the Secretary of State. Next slide, please. The Magnitsky Law was expanded to become the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, this time directed against any foreign person which, based on credible evidence, are responsible for one, extrajudicial killings and other gross human rights violations in any foreign country, who seek to expose illegal activity carried out by government officials, obtain, exercise, defend, or promote internationally recognized human rights and freedoms, such as freedoms of religion, expression, association, etc., acted as an agent of or on behalf of a foreign person in a matter related to an activity described in the earlier paragraph. Next slide, please. It's also applicable to government official or a senior associate of such official that is responsible for or complicit in ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing acts of significant corruption, including the expropriation of private or public assets for personal gain, corruption related to government contracts, or the extraction of natural resources, bribery, or the facilitation or transfer of the proceeds of corruption to foreign jurisdiction, has materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial materials or technological support for goods or services in support of an activity described in the earlier paragraph. Sanctions are the same as those in the earlier Magnitsky Act. As regards the Philippines, a Magnitsky rider in the 2020 U.S. budget was inserted in the 2020 U.S. budget against those involved in the imprisonment of Senator Laila de Lima. The cancellation of the U.S. visa of Senator Bato de la Rosa, although there is no categorical pronouncement from the U.S. Congress or from the U.S. government, is deemed to be in relation to the Magnitsky rider in the 2020 budget. Next slide, please. For sure, we'll not get immediate relief from our local courts. At the same time, we cannot wait for another year before we hold them accountable, human rights violators. We have to start now so that we can start piercing the armor of invincibility created by the pervading climate of impunity. We have to show state agents that they too have vulnerabilities and may someday be held accountable, in the same way that we held General Jovito Palparan accountable for some of his dastardly acts. This may not stop the killings, but this may to a certain extent slow them down, and some lives may be saved. Next slide, please. Finally, while there are available legal remedies under domestic and international laws and mechanisms, this will not provide us with complete relief. Ultimately, it's the people's united action that will produce changes in our socioeconomic and political system. And it's only then that a complete relief is obtained. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much, Attorney Cortez, for sharing your experiences and meaningful insights in relation to the opportunities and limitations of international human rights instruments. So to the audience, our speakers are now ready to take your questions. So you can click on the raise hand button if you have any questions.
Hi, Ima. I think I would like to start the ball rolling for Attorney
Okay.
Cortez. Yeah, I would just like to follow up on the possibility of an ICC action uh, before the term of Duterte ends, for example, because there are several communications filed, but there has been no update so far. And I believe that it has been since 2016 there has been a communication filed. So is that part of the ICC character that it's a long time that it before it takes a decision or so? Thank you.
Uh, Considering the number of incidents um, included in the submission, in the 2018 submission against Duterte, it surely will take some time before the prosecutor will be able to verify them. But as far as we know, before the lockdown in 2020, there were already schedules for taking of testimonies of witnesses. I believe it was scheduled in July of 2020, but the schedule was canceled before because of the pandemic. We hope that uh, uh, before Duterte's term ends, a favorable decision will be issued at least by the prosecutor, and at least for the issuance of a warrant for his arrest.
Thank you, Attorney Cortez, for your concise answer. Um, does anyone have a question? You may use the raise hand function of the Zoom, and you can direct your question to any of the speakers, including the keynote speaker, of course. Ima, do we have some questions from Facebook?
I haven't seen any questions from Facebook, although I think one of our participants from India raised a point in relation to Saros' speech earlier. Hold on, I think we have one question. Shinte Galeshka, you have the floor. Maybe you can introduce yourself and maybe you can provide the name of your organization before you ask your question. Please let us know to whom the question is also addressed. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, it is audible.
I'm not about to ask a question. I'm just going to give a little updates about the situation here in Indonesia. I'm Galeshka from Indonesia. Currently, I'm with KUHA, People Coalition for the Right of Water, but I also work with APMDD. Uh, uh, the situation here is pretty bad actually, though not in a scale of the Palestine or the Myanmar, but the shrinking space is already happened even before the pandemic. And the pandemic make the situation worse because the government this day use the pandemic as a reason to criminalize a lot of rally that we uh, do here in Indonesia. Uh, but more than just criminalizing rallies, the government also use pandemic, the COVID, as methods to intimidate human rights defender. There is a case in Kalimantan in Borneo where several of environmental defender are being raped by the police and health workers, and they were forced to take a COVID test without proper authorization at all, and they search the place of the activists, and they force one of the activists to self-isolation. So not only the pandemic is used as a motivation, it's also used as tools to instill fears toward the human rights defender here in Indonesia. And while we cannot do our activism offline on the street together to do rally, there is also attack in a digital space, not only trolling in Facebook or Twitter, but some of our friends here in Indonesia are being digitally attacked. Their WhatsApp account was hijacked by I think it's an organized effort using sophisticated tools to hijack their communication device, and it is not the first time the digital attack happened, but recently it getting more massive. The last time it was 15 people that being attacked, and even the actor used try to hijack the Zoom session like this, and trolling the Zoom session. But the most critical issue is this digital attack also affect our trust. When you accept a message from your colleague, you have to wonder if this communication really from the person you know. I think it's a trend here in Indonesia, and I think it needs to be addressed. It needs to be I don't know how, but we need to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Galeshka, for your additional input. One of our speakers, would you like to comment on that? Okay, if not, we can proceed with the next question from Facebook. The question is for Yoke, and the question is, what are the prospects of solidarity between the peoples of Asia and Europe given the shrinking civic space experienced by both continents? Thank you.
That's not an easy question, of course, because we are all in our proper offices and our proper countries doing what we need to do, I think. So I think the most important is that in each country that there is some reaction against the fact that measures are taken on a non-democratic way and that the fundamental rights of the people are oppressed. So I think it's very important that in each country everybody should act, so that all over the world we see that the people do not accept all those restrictions of their fundamental rights. On the other hand, I think that it's up to us mostly to explain what's going on in your countries. For example, we did an action, I think 2 weeks ago, in front of because of the killings in the Philippines. And we will continue doing solidarity acts because of all the killings all over. We did it also on the 10th of December, the day of the Fundamental Human Rights anniversary. With our office, we also traveled 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago to the Philippines to do a fact-finding mission, but I think we should continue organizing such things. But of course, well, that's the only thing we can do, I think. Maybe we should inquire also to go more to the international courts to see what we can do. We are doing it now, for example, for several issues. But well, we will keep on being expressing our solidarity and do what we can do, but it's not easy because we only have 24 hours a day, and I think it's important that every struggle supports each other.
Maybe I'd like to just add, I think the solidarity, is very important, and Europe and in a way it's slightly in a better position, but I think these Europe Asia solidarity is really crucial, and I think what the previous speaker has mentioned, we do whatever we can, but I think also that since Europe has the places where there is aid, there is development aid, there is the UN Human Rights Council, the EU Council on Human Rights. So there are many avenues actually in Europe that Asian groups need access to. And while we're doing as much as we can, I think building a solidarity will be very important. I'm also thinking of legal cases against the corporations that are violating human rights in Asia. So it's not just governments, but it's also the corporations, and we need to have a focus on corporate accountability as well, and expose what they're doing, even boycotting their products if possible. So then there are also like more strategic things we can do together. I also think that often when groups and human rights defenders are targeted, they also need support, and whether it's funds for legal cases to support them, or it's even at that level, I think it's still useful to have special funds to support them, to support human rights defenders, environmental defenders, and those ordinary people who have been terrorized and kind of where their human rights violations are taken away. So I think human rights violations are taking place, no? So I think that's really important, and the more creative we are, the better. And for Indonesia, I'm really sorry and to hear that, but I think that's one of the things that sometimes we don't hear enough about from Indonesia, about what's happening on the ground, and we really need that kind of information to build that solidarity networks for Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoke, for addressing the question and for the additional input from the part of Saro. We see two raised hands from the floor. Maybe we can take up the question of Anika, and then maybe Attorney Cortez can come in after. Anika, you have the floor.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, my name is Annika Denkman, and I work with the Asia Pacific Alliance of YMCA in Hong Kong. And my question is mainly targeted to the second speaker from Malaysia, but anyone can answer if they feel like it. Regarding shrinking spaces, and especially considering street protests that have been shut down, like here in Hong Kong, but also in Thailand, and what we're currently seeing and observing in Myanmar, and how laws have been put into place during the pandemic, like very crucial laws and very crucial, like oppressive laws that have been put into place while the world is tackling a pandemic. So my main question is how we can do advocacy work, or how advocacy work can be done in a way that even though the media is focusing on one topic only, which is the still ongoing pandemic, that such laws do not go under, that we still see that they are being like put in place, that we can still voice concerns about them, and that people can still mobilize even though they are maybe or potentially unable to go out into the street. So how have we seen anything, like any idea of an example, or how can that be done? Because I feel like a lot of things have been put into place, especially in the last couple of months, last year, that are extremely oppressive. So yeah, I'm gonna
Thank
stop.
you. Thank you for the question, Annika. I think one, you can see in India actually the farmers movement is so strong that they have been protesting even against the lockdown and everything because of the three farm laws, which is going to impact them very badly, very negatively. Farmers are going to lose livelihoods, and they'll be pushed to contract farming, and the big agro businesses are going to make more profits. And so they are protesting, and they are asking for solidarity as well. And so kind of joining hands with the farmers and with all the different sectors. I think when such a thing happens, as you're right, I mean, it's more difficult to protest now because of the pandemic, and you get arrested. And in Malaysia, I think it's like 10,000 ringgit to if you are not doing social distancing or not wearing your mask. So it's a difficult situation at this point. So exposing what's happening, I think, is very important. Often the media is with the government, with the ruling party, and so having our own social media, social outreach, I think is critical. Every letter you write, every solidarity message you draft, every statement you sign, it still makes impact. And I think I would encourage that. But more than that, I think we need to have this kind of exchanges so that we can support each other. Like learning from what's happening in Indonesia, it's kind of shocking. And so what do we do? So the groups on the ground needs to provide us with the information so that we can also make noise, even if it's not a protest, but at least some kind of social media protest, like what we have been doing in the last year, social media protests. I think that's the reality. And in many countries, you're right, such oppressive laws are being just implemented without any kind of discussion. Parliament is in Malaysia. Parliament is been uh, what do you call, stopped. There's no the parliament cannot meet until because we are under emergency because of COVID. And so even talking to our parliamentarians is of no use because they can't also make noise. But they are continuing to do that with press releases, press conferences, and so it still makes sense to write to them and talk to them and send our messages. And the other aspect, I think, is the movement building. COVID-19 will end. Things may get worse, but definitely the pandemic will pass. And in the meantime, we are building movements. And I think the movement building is which is the one that will give us the strength to protest, to resist, and to come out with alternatives for real right to development. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Anika, and thank you, Sarof, for the response. And Attorney Cortez is raising his hand. We'll probably have his response, and then we can proceed with the breakout sessions.
Yes, I agree. We have to be resourceful in our in protests. Online is one, but of course we also have to be defiant to confront the powers that be. For example, in the Philippines, despite prohibition against mass gathering, we still asserted. We had several already since June 2012, because our assertion is that mass gathering is an essential activity because it's an exercise of our constitutional right to free expression. Several of our leaders and members have already been charged with violation of Public Assembly Act, but several were also dismissed. Just yesterday, another charge of Public Assembly Act was dismissed for the holding of a rally during the Human Rights Day. Again, we have to confront authorities. If we allow them to intimidate us, the repression will continue. And of course, as to international solidarity, I have to emphasize the importance because of our experience in the Philippines. For example, in 2001, we have a spate of extrajudicial killing to the point where one activist is being killed every day. But due to international pressure, the Arroyo administration was forced to allow Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killing Philip Alston to visit and conduct an investigation in the Philippines. True enough, before Alston presented his report to the United Nations Human Rights Council in June of 2007, the number of killings started to drop. So that by September of 2007, at the time that they will adopt the Alston report, there was a dramatic drop in the incident of extrajudicial killings. Another one is the case of Morong 43. The 43 health workers who were arrested during Arroyo's time. Even when Aquino came into power, they were still in detention. But due to international pressure from our networks, after several months in power, Aquino was pushed to the wall and decided to release them. So this is the effect of international solidarity as well as in asserting our rights even during repressive times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Attorney Cortez, for addressing the questions. I think it's time for us to go to our breakout sessions. Is that right, Glenis?
Yes.
Okay, so to all our participants here, thank you for your active participation. We have taken note of the insights that you have placed in the chat box. For those who still have questions, though, we can direct them to the speakers after the webinar. So you can send us a message if you're still reflecting on the input. And then if some questions do come up at a later time, we are open to receiving your questions.
All right, at this point, we will discuss further into breakout groups, two topics, which we already heard from our speakers this afternoon. So one is on challenges and recommendations in strengthening advocacy and engagement with government bodies and other institutions. And then breakout two is on good practices from the ground, from Europe and Asia in forging solidarity among people's movements for resistance and pushbacks. So all the participants have been assigned their breakout rooms according to your answer in the registration form. So we have 15 minutes, and after that, we will come back to the plenary, to this main session room, to give a short report, and then we proceed with the response from our parliamentarians. So let's have a fruitful 15 minutes, and please proceed to your breakout rooms. Thank you.
The Cordillera region in the northern part of the Philippines is the ancestral homeland of various indigenous peoples comprising the majority of 1.7 million regional population. Half of the population are located in the urban Baguio City and the province of Benguet, where two large mining companies are operating. Being the mountainous and cold climate, the region supplies 70% of temperate vegetables in the country, as well as being the major producer of cut flowers. Thus, with the lockdown quickly imposed on the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the most affected are the informal workers in the urban city, farmers of cut flowers, and the vegetable industry. Because indigenous farmers in the interior communities are producing for their own communities and own consumption, the dislocation is on the disruption of their otherwise seasonal work in the urban and provincial centers.
I am Carmen Bulinto, a health worker working here in the Cordillera region. And I also teach in the university with nursing students. And I also volunteer with non-government organizations in health. Now, on the second to the last day of our clinical duty in the community, the government officials declared that there should be a closure of businesses, of business establishments, of the schools. In relation to the vulnerable communities, I would like to believe that these vulnerable communities are those in the marginalized sectors, in the far-flung areas. They will be at a more double risks in case the infection will enter the communities. They have been so isolated geographically, and that can be a positive protection for them. But once people who are coming from the outside, like for example from the cities or from overseas, and these are people coming from positive COVID communities, then they will be the most vulnerable. Why? Again, because the healthcare system that is supposed to take care of them is not ready, and it's very inadequate. The services are inadequate, the hospitals, the facilities, the health manpower, and the medicines and others, most especially for the protective personal equipment, these are very inadequate to give them support. As a healthcare professional, I think one of the most important challenge is really to support these indigenous communities, those who are in the marginalized areas, because if no one will do that to them, they will be at so much risk. We have been demanding for mass testing, but it has never been given to the people, especially for the health workers.
Nung last March, yun na, nagkakanda-kanda hirap na yung mga taxi, jeepney, UB Express. And so, with the bus companies na pinahinto nung pandemic na to, malaki yung epekto sa kabuhayan namin na mga driver sa maliliit na operator.
Katawan mo ti dadu mga alternative ta lockdown nga ron siyang agutang siyang kalpasan da iti puwi da ka kabutbutong mo nga utang ati sansangon tumanen nga sumaron.
Nagrugi ti lockdown ket jay nagrugi met nga awan tinaila ko nga pulos jay nulami ket naibasura amin titansyak lang pan nga 200,000.
Ti epekto na dahito ang pandemya ket talaga nga krisis han kami nga makalako awan ti panggata ti kanon ni adaman ti ito ti gobyerno talaga nga kurang.
The Cordillera People's Alliance is an alliance of 307 people's organizations and sectoral organizations in the different provinces of the Cordillera region in northern Philippines. Throughout these decades as well, we have been partnering with the Center for Development Programs in the Cordillera, especially in providing socio-economic projects or support to far-flung indigenous communities in the region. Throughout these decades of our existence, As an organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance has been experiencing attacks for speaking out against corporate projects such as large-scale mining and large dams, for criticizing policies of the government that impact negatively on Cordillera indigenous peoples, as well as indigenous peoples in other parts of the country. So during the time of COVID, the attacks against us have intensified, especially through social media, particularly Facebook. So since the lockdown in March until now, there are numerous posts at Facebook and other social media platforms that tag us as terrorists, as communists, as recruiters of the New People's Army. They also vilify us, portraying us as evils or demons. Last year, the government has implemented the Executive Order 70 of President Duterte. That is the whole-of-nation approach to end insurgency in the country. But the problem with this executive order is that it targets legitimate people's organizations, and that includes the Cordillera People's Alliance. So we fear for our lives. But instead of the government addressing these attacks or looking into these attacks so that it will stop, it has passed the anti-terrorism law. It targets all the more political dissenters, activists, human rights defenders, environmental defenders. So this will mean shrinking space of civil society here in the country. It will mean silencing the people. For us indigenous peoples, one of our utmost concerns is that with this terror law, our very own struggles against large-scale mining and destructive dams may be interpreted as acts of terrorism, because terrorism is very vague as defined in this law. It could mean violations of our basic human rights. They could arrest us without warrants, detain us without charges. With this law, we want that this law will be repealed. We want that this law will be jumped.
The Center for Development Programs in the Cordillera is an NGO advocating for the right to food, right to livelihood, right to health in human rights and indigenous people's rights perspective.
A lot is happening in Palestine right now, particularly in Jerusalem and Gaza. Here are 3 things you should know about it. Number 1, this is ethnic cleansing, not a real estate dispute. As the recent major Human Rights Watch report shows, the status quo for all Palestinians living under Israeli rule is apartheid. Now, Israel imposes different forms of apartheid on different Palestinians, but for all of them, Israel engages in systemic, institutionalized discrimination and a crushing denial of their most basic rights. That started with the establishment of Israel, when it drove out more than 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes and destroyed more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages in order to create a Jewish majority in a place that had a Palestinian Arab majority. And what's happening today is a continuation of that process. In the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli government is pushing to expel Palestinians out of their homes in order to give those homes to Israeli settlers. And this isn't the first time that this is happening.
It's becoming a familiar scene in East Jerusalem. Jewish settlers taking over a Palestinian home and dumping the furniture in the garden. This is the settlers' strategy. House by house, family by family, they're trying to take over the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. They're doing so with the full cooperation of the Israeli police and the Israeli courts. And it's a pattern that's repeating all over East Jerusalem.
And to make matters worse, these families in Sheikh Jarrah were already refugees driven out from their homes when Israel was established. Now, while some Israeli leaders are upfront about this being an effort to drive out Palestinians to achieve demographic dominance in Jerusalem, others try to hide their real aim and pretend that this is all a real estate dispute that the Israeli courts can handle. But let's not forget that this is all happening in East Jerusalem, which is occupied Palestinian territory that Israel has no legal claim to whatsoever. A mountain of UN resolutions makes that much clear. Expelling an occupied people out of their homes in order to transfer the occupiers' population into those homes is a war crime under international law. Number 2, racism and brutality are on full display. The violence in Jerusalem did not come out of nowhere. It's been slowly brewing on the back of rising bigotry and incitement by Israeli leaders. In fact, the head of the so-called Jewish Power Party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the guy who says that the Israeli terrorist who massacred 29 Palestinians in a mosque is his hero, is now sitting in the Israeli Knesset and is allies with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the same guy seen here standing next to the deputy mayor of Jerusalem as he taunted an injured Palestinian demonstrator and saying that he wished he had been shot in the head. This incident came just days after mobs of Jewish supremacists in the hundreds took the streets of Jerusalem chanting death to Arabs and assaulting scores of random innocent Palestinians. With Palestinian demonstrators drawing attention to the impending ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needed a distraction, and the surest way to get one is to keep escalating violence against Palestinians until he could provoke a violent response so he could switch up the narrative. So it was no surprise that Israeli occupation forces drastically escalated their violence, brutalizing unarmed Palestinian demonstrators and invading their holiest places of worship, with scenes of Israeli mobs chanting genocidal slogans as flames from Israel's assault on the Al-Aqsa compound burned in the background. Now, just imagine if the situation were reversed. If it was armed Palestinians invading Jewish places of worship and brutalizing unarmed Israelis in videos that littered social media, that footage would be playing on a loop as breaking news on just about every network. Unfortunately, many did not pay attention until what happened next. Number 3, Israel is massacring civilians in Gaza. In the face of sustained racist brutality towards Palestinians and attacks on their holiest sites, militants in Gaza fired rockets at Israel, and now a lot of people are referring to Israel's bombing of Gaza as a response. But there are two things to keep in mind here. The first is that Israel is inherently the initiator of violence simply by being an occupying power present by force on Palestinian land, imposing apartheid on an occupied people. And this includes Gaza, where Palestinians are under siege and occupation, trapped with no access to the outside world. Israel claiming self-defense in this situation is every bit as absurd as an armed and violent intruder in your home claiming to be defending themselves. And then Israel is yet again responsible for escalating the violence by expanding its ethnic cleansing and assaulting demonstrators and places of worship. So if you're thinking about referring to a cycle of violence, just remember this key context. This is violence between an oppressor imposing occupation and apartheid and the victims of that oppression and apartheid. Only one side here, Israel, holds all of the power, has all of the fighter jets, controls all of the borders, and is imposing systemic oppression on an entire people. To speak of this as if there are two equal sides is to distort the most basic reality. The second thing is that Israel regularly bombs civilian areas in Gaza indiscriminately, to the condemnation of every major human rights organization in the world. Back in 2014, they killed more than 500 Palestinian children in the span of 6 weeks. And in just the last few days, they've killed no less than 27 Palestinian children and brought down entire apartment buildings. These are also war crimes, and they are the end result of Israel's refusal to see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same dignity and rights that Israelis have. And now, after endless incitement, a horror show is unfolding throughout Israel, where mobs are breaking into random Palestinian homes and attacking the residents while children scream, destroying random Palestinian businesses, and interrogating random drivers on the
Hello, welcome back. Hello, welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to fully discuss your respective topics. Is everybody here? Yes. Um, Okay, so now we have a short report back from the two sessions, just 2 to 3 minutes each, please, and then we can proceed with our parliamentarians because they're very busy and they still have to attend their session. So please, um, the rapporteurs, you may take the floor. Reporter for breakout one first, and then um, short for breakout two, and then we will have our parliamentarians. Thank you. The rapporteur for breakout one, or we can have the rapporteur from breakout two if breakout one is not yet ready.
Hello.
Hello,
Okay.
you have the floor.
Okay. For the breakout session 2, we've discussed two questions that focused on the good practices of in forging solidarity amongst people's movements for resistance and assertion of pushbacks against shrinking spaces and political repression, as well as a question on how we can build solidarity in during the time of the pandemic, especially when um, governments are pushing the business as usual narrative. So, um, uh, a main point in the discussion was about the use of the digital space or digital platforms on how civil society organizations maximize these platforms or transitioned into these platforms during the start of the pandemic. And they did this through converting their materials into videos, into a more creative avenue in the social media space, so that it would also have a larger reach. Another pro of this of maximizing the digital platforms is um, an increase in collaboration amongst CSOs and people's organizations in different countries and different places. Another good practice that we've discussed is the continuous outreach to the grassroots communities, especially in the rural areas wherein technology is there is a technology gap. So the CSOs brought their campaigns to the digital platforms or to the social media space. And another is on building solidarity and pushing people-centered solutions. CSOs also shared their experience in engaging with multilateral institutions and being part of international networks, such as the use of the engagement mechanism of APRN, which allowed them to bring their campaigns and talk to multilateral institutions like the UN. Um, there was also a point raised in regards to the use of the digital space, wherein we must also be careful since the digital space is very sensitive in terms of like surveillance and how it can be easily forged, and it makes the CSOs and POs vulnerable. I think that's it for the breakout session 2.
Thank you so much for that, LJ. May we have the report back of the first breakout session?
Maybe we lost Galesh. He's
Hello?
supposed to
Oh, he's
report.
there.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Take 2 minutes, Galesh, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. The challenge about people movement, people resistance in current pandemic, COVID pandemic. The challenge is there is a lot of methods that the state use against the people movement, while we are restricted in our offline activities, so that we have to move to online activism. There is also an attack in online activism, where the state is using trolls, social media trolls, and also surveillance and digital attack. And I think, and we discussed that we need to have more solidarity among movement across regions, and that's it, because time is not enough for everybody to talk. But I think that's the main challenge with us on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Galesh, for your report. And now we are now at the point that our parliamentarians, our invited parliamentarians, will give their response. And we have two of very progressive and parliamentarians who are also human rights defenders themselves. So first up, we have Severine de la Velliere. Severine is a member of the Federal Parliament of Belgium, of the party Ecolo, or the Greens, and she wants to link citizen struggles, especially those related to social justice, climate justice, international solidarity, and gender justice, with political actions at the federal level. And second, after Severine, we have Honorable Arlene Brosas. She's the representative in the 18th Congress of Gabriela Women's Party, the sole party list representing the women's sector. She is currently the Assistant Minority Leader in the House of Representatives and serves as the Vice President for party list of the Association of Women Legislators Foundation. So first we have Severine. Thank you, Severine. You have the floor.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we hear you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I think the camera is still off, but I cannot switch it on myself. The system tells me that. Oh yes, now it seems that it works. No, yes, I'm here. I can see myself. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for the fruitful debates that we have had for the last hour and a half almost. And I'm very sorry because our plenary session in the Belgian Parliament has just begun, and I have to attend. So I will be probably a bit shorter than I wish I was able to do. But I will probably do share some thoughts about how we can try to struggle for more social justice from the parliament, especially during these times of COVID and in regards with international solidarity. Because in the parliament, I am also in charge of the topics linked to international solidarity. So I will go back to that. Mrs. Calwart has, I think, really clearly explained the situation in Belgium these last 14 months, I think. And it was, I think, really interesting to hear from her that although in Belgium our situation is obviously easier than in most countries in the world, we are facing very specific issues due to COVID in terms of increased poverty and decrease of our democratic and social rights. And obviously, as parliamentarian, member of parliament, our job to control the government and to come up with new proposition of laws was somehow more difficult too. So probably a few words. We try as member of the parliament to put as much pressure as we can on the member of the government. That means that we constantly come back with very specific questions about how can you, as Belgian government, use your pressure to make sure that other states in the world where the civil rights of the population are just going down, how can you put pressure and make sure that these governments feel the threat of diplomacy and of free trade, and to change their strategies towards the local population. So a very basic example. I try to follow the situation in the Philippines, for example, from the parliament. The link between Belgium and the Philippines is very tiny. We don't have a lot of diplomatic or trade agreements between Belgium and the Philippines. That means that our government is not really focused on what's going on in the Philippines, for example. So we have to, as member of parliament, make sure that the Philippines stays on the agenda of the government. And how do we do that as member of the parliament? We come back with new questions regularly, and we try to make the link between the activists in the Philippines and in Belgium, the struggles that they are leading on the ground, and make sure that these struggles have an impact in the parliament, and that the minister can hear what's going on and make sure that it stays up the agenda. And in that terms, it's not really easy because, for example, the last answer of Madame Wilmès, our minister, was really deceiving, I think, because when we asked her, okay, what can you do more to make Duterte change his strategy towards his population? And she says, no, I think now he understands, and he will is committed to do better and try to stop the extrajudicial killings, for example. And so our job as member of parliament is just to say to the minister, this is not enough. And you know that because it's been more than 15 years that the population in the Philippines are killed. It was not Duterte for 15 years, but obviously the situation is getting worse and worse. And so we have to ask the government to change the strategy. So that's the first thing that we can do. The second one is trying to make sure that we change the laws about trade, because we know that between Europe, not Belgium, but between Europe and Asia as a whole, but also the Philippines, for example, but also Brazil, also Palestine, many countries were suffering the pressure of leaders who are struggling against their own population. We think that trade is a very good weapon to deal with that countries. So this is something that we try to do. For example, these days with Palestine, and we asked the government to make sanctions against these countries. But as you know, in Belgium now we have the liberals in the government, not only the liberals, because the socialists and the Greens are there too, but as long as we have the liberals, it's very, very difficult to use trade as a weapon, because trade has to be free, and regardless the impact on the population in the southern countries. So we try to do that also, but mainly what I think is mainly our job, and I've just mentioned that earlier, is trying to make the link between the population who are raising forces on the ground and the parliament. So it's trying to keep a foot on the ground in the southern countries and in Belgium, and try to make this link between the government and the southern countries. Maybe just a last point, and then unfortunately I will have to leave. I am very focused these days on two different topics. The first one is to raise more money, public money, for global solidarity. As you know, Belgium has committed to give 0.7% of our RNB, national income, to global solidarity. And Belgium is far lower to that target. And so we try to pressure our government to raise more money for global solidarity, especially regarding the situation with the pandemic. So this is one thing I'm very busy right now to do from the parliament. And the second thing is the access to the vaccine against COVID-19, because as you know, the rich countries have taken all the doses which are available on the market, and now the big pharmacist industry want to keep the process for themselves. And as member of the parliament, we pressure our government to make sure that Europe finally decide to stop the I'm sorry, I'm looking for the words, the les brevets, the patent on the vaccine. So we try to do that as strongly as we can from the parliament, and hopefully we will be heard in the following days. Now I'm convinced that we will be heard alongside the European population, who is pressuring the government also. So this is probably the few things that I was able to share today. I'm very sorry to be so short, but I have to speak in my plenary just right now. Thank you, and thank you once again for the invitation, and all my solidarity with every one of you who are struggling every day for more social justice.
Thank you, Severine. Thank you very much for your inputs. And yeah, I hope you will have a good session today, and good luck to that. And thank you also for your support to the Filipino people's struggle for human rights and democracy. And now, may we hear the response of Honorable Arlene Brosas of Gabriela Women's Party. You have the floor, Representative Arlene.
Thank you, Glenys. Thank you. It is an honor to speak before this online webinar of the Asian People's Forum to share the current situation in the Philippines, particularly on people's campaigns on reclaiming closing civic spaces towards effectively implementing and promoting partnership in governance. First, we thank IBON International, Europe, the Council for People's Development and Governance, Viva Salud, People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty, and Asia Pacific Research Network for inviting us on board this platform. Now, democratic representation in policymaking, especially of women and marginalized groups, remain limited even up to this age. Parliaments around the world remain male-dominated, with women occupying only 1/4 of the seats on a global average. It is in this context that strengthening democratic women representation in parliaments constitutes a very important advocacy. That is why we are here. It is also in this light that I am proud to be the representative of Gabriela Women's Party in the Philippine Congress, as it is currently the sole women's party list in the Philippines and in the world. Gabriela Women's Party has been consistent in promoting the rights and welfare of marginalized and underrepresented Filipino women. We stand for women empowerment. We stand for social justice. We stand for just and lasting peace. For over 20 years, we have consistently fought and stood for women, children, and nation, combating all forms of discrimination and violence against women and children, clamoring for land rights, decent jobs and housing, fighting for lower prices of goods and services, and against regressive tax measures. We have advanced key legislative measures which were signed into law, including the Magna Carta of Women, the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act, the Anti-Violence Against Women and Children Act, the Expanded Maternity Leave Act, among other measures that promote women's and children's rights welfare. We are deeply rooted in marginalized communities as we provide services and assistance to victims of sexual violence and abuse, and to those affected by typhoons and other natural calamities. We have consistently rejected and called out misogyny and macho fascism, as we remain strongly critical of President Duterte's sexist remarks in official functions. Our Labanan ang Abuso campaign, translated as Fight the Abuse, has left a mark in various platforms as a rallying call for women and speaking out versus sexual violence and abuse. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, militarist restrictions, and worst economic crisis in the Philippines came about. Filipino women bear the brunt of social and economic pressures. More than 4.3 million women workers were thrown to either joblessness or precarious state. An average of 8 Filipina are raped or abused daily. And this could get worse with the prolonged quarantine restrictions. Despite the very pressing need to ensure women's representation, the Duterte administration is very keen on kicking us out of the halls of Congress through various means, much like how authoritarian regimes are pursuing blatant machinations to stifle, silence, and further marginalize women and other marginalized groups in policymaking. This has been the alarming trend in Southeast Asia in recent years, with opposition leaders, including female political figures, under heavy political attacks from the ruling regimes. Gabriela Women's Party is currently at risk of being removed from the parliament because of a case filed by no less than President Duterte's red tagging task force. In 2019, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAP, filed a petition before the Commission on Elections to cancel our party list registration. The case stirs up false accusations linking us to the Communist Party of the Philippines and falsely claiming that we supposedly received foreign funding. What is clear is that the case, which remains active up to this hour, we had about 2 hearing sessions already, is designed to deny Filipino women a seat in the parliament, even at a time when rising sexual abuses, domestic violence, and rock bottom impoverishment of families amid the pandemic warrant a strong voice of women in the chambers of power. This case is a clear and present danger to Filipino women representation in the parliament and sets the stage for worse crackdown on critical women voices. We in Gabriela Women's Party and in the Makabayan Bloc, which is the coalition of different party lists, progressive party lists, have also been subjects of unrelenting red tagging and terrorist tagging by state security forces themselves. In various social media platforms, we have been repeatedly and maliciously linked to the Communist Party of the Philippines despite lack of concrete evidence, endangering our lives, safety, and security. As revealed by Facebook last year, the military is actually running a social media campaign to spread fake news and incite hatred and sexual violence against us and other progressive groups, which we describe as literal army trolls, army of trolls. The faces and names of our leaders and organizers, mine included, are maliciously plastered on several memes, posters, flyers, and banners, accusing us of being communist terrorists. Worse, the accusations are heavily twisted so that the new draconian anti-terror law will be weaponized against us. Women representation in the Philippine Congress is on the line as I speak. Women activists and female opposition figures continue to languish in jail, facing warrantless arrests and suffer from trumped-up charges. Even female celebrities who are perceived to be supportive of our cause to end violence against women are red tagged by the Duterte generals in the NTF-LCAC. And to be red tagged in the Philippines is to face the imminent threat of getting killed. This is how serious the situation is. Now we need to send the message out. The Philippine government is out on a rampage to demolish every single opposition to its tyrannical rule. We need allies in our quest to stop this madness. We need allies in our struggle for truth, for justice, and for genuine democracy. We need to pressure to cut financing on the Duterte regime's mounting human rights violations against civilians and parliamentarians alike. We fervently hope that progressive organizations in other parts of the world will stand in solidarity with us to defend democratic women representation in the Philippines and to stop the human rights violations under the current regime. While, of course, we support the campaigns and people's recommendations all across Asia and Europe, it is really important to recognize and fortify people's movement to affect change in the society. And in the above context, we are one and in solidarity with people's many initiatives to resist and fight back against civil and political repression amidst reprisals and brazen human rights violations. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you for your positive and encouraging response, Honorable Arlene Rosas, and of course to Severine's response earlier as well. We thank our parliamentarians to the commitment to civic spaces and people's movements in Asia and in Europe. At this point, we greatly need the support of concerned and progressive parliamentarians in obtaining concrete results in terms of policy and getting these issues to become a broader and more, let's just say, in getting these issues within the broader and wider public. At this point as well, we call on Mara Medrano of Asia Pacific Research Network to close our substantive and lively webinar. Please do not forget to share our live stream and post about this event on social media.
Thank you, Ima, and thank you to all our speakers, Yoke Saro, Attorney Ray, Representative Arlene, and of course, Severine. This is an illuminating discussion, and allow me to flesh out some points from the discussion and share my thoughts. So in a global setup where there is a widening poverty inequality, and deteriorating conditions are experienced by the people, the role of civil society organizations has become very important to safeguard the rights of the people and act as development champions. But despite this, governments has been imposing restrictive measures such as complex registration process, challenges and restrictions in funding, attacks on human rights defenders, and so much more, only to suppress the already closing civic spaces. In addition to the pressure felt by the sector, governments has been weaponizing the COVID-19 response to cover up their negligence since the beginning of the lockdown. Legislative and executive orders have given the state a freer rein in amending laws affecting our fundamental rights, such as our rights to associations, our right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, which consequently resulted to criminalization of civil society organizations. But in our discussion, we heard the stories of resistance of CSOs and grassroots organizations overcoming these challenges and impediments. The stories shared by our speakers and as well as our participants on their best practices and lessons learned in asserting their rights to development and social justice brought us great lesson and inspiration. That amid the upsurge of socio-economic and human rights attacks across Europe and of course, especially in Asia, civil society organizations and people's movements continue to call forth genuine and people-centered responses towards the multitude of crises in the world, with the goal to power through a development agenda that is anchored in people's needs. And so we call on governments to uphold and protect the people's rights and to stop all attacks on human rights defenders and civil society organizations. But instead, national governments should recognize the civil society's valuable contribution in the pandemic response and development processes and maximize their knowledge and experiences. Government's resources, especially the so-called anti-insurgency funds, must be directed towards ensuring efficient pandemic response. And of course, in order to truly provide an enabling environment for the civil society, development actors should address the issues that hinders genuine transformative progress. Because while the systemic barriers remain unresolved, we know that poverty, hunger, inequality, and conflicts and human rights violation will only get worse. The economic repression and amid all its perils, we know that CSOs and people's movements had proven their invincible force. And day by day, we are astonished by the growing movements of people across the globe that are shaking these repressive states. In these trying times, our cooperation, our compassion, and creativity are exemplary. It also proves that our collective action is the key motive in realizing change and overcoming adversities. Now more than ever, we must extend our solidarity from defeating this pandemic to creating a social system that is owned and shaped by the people, a society that prioritizes the people's rights and development over corporate interest. And we hope that our discussion has enlightened us and brought us inspiration to carry on with our struggle that could truly promote the people-centered growth, genuine equality, and just and peaceful society. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations to our organizers for this successful event.
Thank you, Mara, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon's evening's event, and hope to see you soon in our future webinars. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good night. Have a fruitful day and have a fruitful evening. Thank you very much.